in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. When I say aerobic metabolism, I mean ATP that is generated by transporting electrons down the electron transfer system within the mitochondria, where ultimately oxygen gets reduced to water, and in that process, oxygen is being consumed. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, where we're going to discuss all things VO2max. Robbie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Batterson. How are you?
I'm good. It's always fun. We recorded probably like 30 minutes of talking before the episode.
But we've been talking for an hour.
Yeah. We've been talking for an hour. We recorded 30 minutes before this, and now we're recording our VO2max episode. If you are interested, I'm trying to figure out a way where I can provide the extra content that we record before and after episodes to people, maybe through either a Patreon or a subscription thing, just to help support the channel and all of that. So it'll probably be a subscription, probably not too expensive, but if you want to hear what happens, discussions behind the scenes, and other things like that, I'll link to more information about that coming up. But today, the big thing that we're going to talk about is VO2max. VO2max, I think, is either way too overemphasized in people's training plans or not emphasized enough. It's never like oh yeah, VO2max, I do enough and that's it. It's either VO2max is life, or I've never even heard of VO2max, or what do I do with it? So I think what we can do is we can start with, kind of a definition of VO2max, and then maybe a little bit of historical context, because I think it's really interesting that this number, definition of VO2max is the maximal amount of oxygen you can uptake and utilize during whole body exercise at high intensities. And it's important to note that it's the maximum amount of oxygen you can uptake and utilize at these high intensities, because it essentially sets the ceiling for our aerobic potential, in a sense, our aerobic engine. It gives us the size of our aerobic engine.
Yes. And just for all the scientists listening, Phil just said the maximal rate of whole body oxygen consumption.
Did I say amount?
That's what I heard.
So maximal rate of whole body oxygen consumption, because it's VO2max, not just V.
Well, it's just per minute, right? It's per unit of time.
Yeah. So it's essentially the size of your aerobic engine. Like we've talked about this during the Predictors of Performance podcast, and it just tells us, are you a V4, a V6, a V8, or a V10? And many studies have been done. Actually, VO2max essentially dates back, to the 1920s, where A.V. Hill, and there's a couple other people that I don't think get mentioned enough, but A.V. Hill is the big one. Noticed that when I'm pretty sure he was collecting data on himself, but when he would run at faster and faster paces around this grass track that they had at his university, there would come a point where oxygen consumption wouldn't go any higher. And, I'm pretty sure they were just breathing into a Douglas bag. So he was wearing essentially a backpack that would inflate over the course of, running faster and faster. And then they would analyze how much oxygen was accumulated in that time. And then they could say, oh, well, this is how much oxygen was actually being utilized. And from that, they were actually able to make a lot of really, really cool inferences and a lot of really, really cool postulations that almost still are held true today, which is really cool.
Yep. And linear response, it's not parabolic, it's not exponential. There's a linear response. As exercise or as metabolic demand increases, there's a linear increase in the demand for oxygen, because we primarily satisfy metabolic demand through the aerobic production of ATP via our mitochondria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that is super important to note. So you'll see um, metabolic devices or other devices that are measuring oxygen consumption, and essentially what we can say is we can say ATP breakdown occurs at the muscle. It occurs at the contractile elements, your myosin and your actin. And then from there, your ATP is replenished by ATP resynthesis. ATP resynthesis, for the most part, for especially early exercise, is almost entirely made up for by aerobic metabolism. When I say aerobic metabolism, I mean ATP that is generated by transporting electrons down the electron transfer system within the mitochondria, where ultimately oxygen gets reduced to water, and in that process, oxygen is being consumed. So if oxygen is being, or if oxygen is the primary way that we get more ATP, and we know that for a certain amount of breakdown of ATP requires a certain amount of energy, then by measuring the amount of oxygen that is happening at our mouths, we can actually estimate the amount of energy that is being expended, whole body metabolism in calories every minute during exercise. So
Very
yeah.
accurately.
So this process is called indirect calorimetry, because you are indirectly measuring energy expenditure based on the amount of oxygen that's being consumed and that connection that I just made. Whereas direct calorimetry would be you have somebody in a room like the room that I'm sitting in recording this podcast, and then you measure how much heat is being generated by that person by measuring how much the water temperature is being increased during different exercise intensities, and then you can more accurately measure energy expenditure. However, it's not very realistic to put a water shell around a room and have somebody exercise in that room.
And it's hard to differentiate the sources of heat, right? Like if they're running on a treadmill, the treadmill itself, the engine is a source of heat. The friction from the soles of the shoes on the treadmill surface. Yeah. I mean, calorimetry is the measurement of calorie of heat, right? So direct calorimetry is a direct measurement of heat production, whereas indirect calorimetry is indirectly using gas exchange, oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production as estimates for that energy transfer.
Yeah. And I think, that was, I wasn't planning on talking about calorimetry in this case, but I do think that is one important thing that we can do by measuring whole body oxygen consumption just at the mouth is get an idea of how many calories we're burning or how much energy is being output during exercise. But I think what we need to do, I think we need to take a step back and we need to say, well, how is VO2 actually determined? Like if for example, if we didn't have something like indirect calorimetry or something like that, what is the equation physiologically that actually dictates VO2? And the answer to that is the Fick equation. So this guy Fick came up with the Fick equation, and it's cardiac output times a VO2 difference is equal to VO2, or the rate of oxygen consumption. Where cardiac output is how much oxygenated blood your heart is pumping per minute, and AVO2 diff is the amount of oxygen that is getting extracted across the capillary beds. So how much oxygen is left over after it passes from your arteries to your veins. And then from that, we can actually understand what the amount of oxygen consumption is, because it's delivery based and it's utilization based. And you have to take into account both of those.
Yeah. Think about finances. If you meet with your financial advisor and they're like, hey, we need to figure out how you can stop spending money. What factors do you need to know? You have to know how much the person makes and then how much they spend. And so that cardiac output kind of tells you how much they make. It gives you a general idea of the ability to deliver oxygen, because oxygen is transported in our blood. And so cardiac output is a surrogate for oxygen delivery. And the components of oxygen delivery are going to be the cardiac capacity. So how much blood volume is there? What's the heart's ability to pump blood? And then how much hemoglobin, how many erythrocytes, red blood cells, and how much hemoglobin are in the blood. So collectively, that's the surrogate for like how much money, how much oxygen does your body have to transport throughout to your tissues, metabolically active tissues during exercise. And then the AVO2 difference is how much of that oxygen that you're delivering is being utilized. And so you can take those measurements at any given state. It's not just at max. You could have it at rest. You could have it at any submaximal exercise intensity. You could have it at maximal exercise intensity. And that Fick equation helps determine what the rate of oxygen consumption is at any given time.
Yeah, and the challenge with the Fick equation is that it's really, really hard to measure, say, cardiac output. We can measure heart rate really, really well. And that's why, or let's take a step back. Cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. So how fast your heart can beat and how much blood you are pumping per beat. And it's really, really easy to measure heart rate because we have heart rate straps for that. But stroke volume is really, really challenging to actually measure. And I'm trying to think, from a methodological perspective, what do you think is the best way to actually measure stroke volume? Can we do it?
Oh boy. Yeah. How to do it? I was not prepared for this. So I've only indirectly measured it, where you can use different tracers. Like I've used, I think it was like xenon, maybe, where it's an inert gas and you give a known amount and you breathe it in and it's absorbed into the bloodstream, and then you'll breathe it out. And so taking into account things like heart rate, the concentration, then you measure how much is being expired, and you can do it indirectly. However, those techniques have their inaccuracies. And so I would have to confirm, because I've never done this, but I think you may be able to actually catheterize your left ventricle, probably down through your carotid, I believe. And so you have a flow meter. And so you could actually measure the flow of blood. And I don't know if you'd actually need to go in the left ventricle. You could probably just go in the aortic arch.
Yeah, just the aortic arch.
I'm not sure. Right.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just thinking about it because I know that there's
not good ways.
Yeah.
But somebody like a Ben Levine, a Michael Joyner, these are Craig Crandall, very well-known cardiovascular experts that I'm pretty sure you can measure it directly. It's just pretty invasive.
Yeah. And I think, okay, so the bottom line for that is that measuring cardiac output is pretty tough. And so I think this is for hemoglobin mass, but carbon monoxide rebreathing, right? That's for changes in hemoglobin, like after exercise.
Yes. So carbon monoxide rebreathing is a great way. And actually, so my former advisor, Carson Lundby, now has a medical device that does this, and he's selling them around the world. Because carbon monoxide has a higher affinity, a higher desire to bind to hemoglobin than even oxygen does. And that's why if you're sitting in your garage, with the generator going or your car, you want to make sure it's ventilated, because there's carbon monoxide buildup that if you breathe in will bind really well to your hemoglobin, preventing the ability to bind oxygen. So you can use that same kind of tracer methodology with providing a little known amount of carbon monoxide, allow that to circulate, and then measure the existence of that carbon monoxide. And you can back calculate blood volumes. You can back calculate red cell volume, how much of your blood is made out of red blood cells, how much of your volume is plasma, and you add them together for total blood volume.
Yeah, but still running into the issues that, we're not really able to figure out stroke volume, just because it is more challenging to measure. So that's how you would measure it in a real world situation. We can really, really well, measure heart rate. Measuring stroke volume is a little bit more challenging. So cardiac output is challenging to measure. And then on the other side of the equation, AVO2 difference is the difference in oxygen concentration between your arteries and then your veins, with the idea that, the blood is traveling right through the arteries to smaller and smaller vessels, where eventually it's going to hit the muscle. The muscle is going to be utilizing a lot of oxygen, especially during exercise. And then following that, the blood will eventually reach the veins. And in order to get a true measurement of this, you have to catheterize, right, both sides. And you have to measure the oxygen concentration in both the arteries and in the veins. Now we have some other technologies and devices like near-infrared spectroscopy that can get us an idea of oxygen balance. In a sense, we can't measure truly, AVO2 difference, but we can get an idea: is demand higher than delivery, or vice versa, based on the trends that we're seeing, within those devices. We just still don't really have, the full, say, picture in AVO2 diff. So from a mathematical perspective, it's like, oh, very simple, cardiac output times AVO2 diff. From a practical perspective, it's actually really hard, because it's really hard to measure stroke volume. It's really hard to measure AVO2 difference. And then the good thing is that indirect calorimetry has been introduced. So we can actually just measure oxygen consumption, and then kind of fill in the blanks with the other variables that we actually know. So from that perspective, and I think so, something that I want to try to do is incorporate questions into the podcast. So I asked a bunch of people on my Instagram the other day, what do you want to know about VO2max? And I think this kind of one of these questions fits really well right here. So the question was, how reliable are VO2max tests, and what are their limitations? And I think what we need to first start at is, like, what is a VO2max test, right? So we just talked a lot about VO2, oxygen consumption. So what is a VO2max test? A VO2max test is a progressively harder exercise intensity test where you're measuring oxygen consumption via indirect calorimetry, so oxygen consumption and CO2 production at the mouth, and then you're seeing how high that VO2max value gets. So we just talked about the limitations of the Fick equation. Robbie, if you could talk to VO2max testing, what are the things we need to look out for when we're doing these maximal ramp exercise tests to exhaustion? And maybe what are the limitations within the technology? What are the limitations within the tests? And then we can kind of, pick it apart from there.
So with a VO2max test, like you were discussing with AV Hill, when he realized when he would run around the track faster, the VO2, the rate at which his body was consuming oxygen was increased at faster intensity. So at harder workloads, until a certain workload where it didn't increase. Well, everybody has a different VO2 max, and we need to find out what that is. It takes time biologically for our body to adjust. You readjust blood flow, increase heart rate, increase venous return. And so there's time is important for a VO2 max test, because if you increase it too fast, you're not allowing the biological reflexes to catch up to a given metabolic demand. So it has to increase slow enough so that the body's able to manage that incremental increase in metabolic demand. However, we all have limitations in energy supply and in endogenous inside of our body energy supply. So if the test is too long, first, people aren't going to want to do it, most of all. But then, second of all, your endogenous supply of especially carbohydrate may become limiting. who knows on a day in, day out basis how full your liver and your glycogen stores are, your liver glycogen and skeletal muscle glycogen stores are. And so when somebody's just coming in, you also can't bank on having a super long test, because then the limiting factors may actually be endogenous substrate supply rather than actual true VO2 max. And so over the years had to find a balance between what is kind of considered like as fast as a VO2 max test should be versus how long maybe a VO2 max test should be, right?
Yeah. And I think one of the follow-up questions is as well, whoa, you just said carbohydrate oxidation. I thought carbohydrate oxidation was totally anaerobic. And guys, I know it's not totally anaerobic. There's a lot of questions that I get that where people assume that carbohydrate oxidation is fully anaerobic. So I want to clear this up as well. So I'll pitch it over to you, and then I'll share my thoughts. So I thought,
okay,
the question is, I thought carbohydrate oxidation was totally anaerobic. So why would I be relying on carbohydrate during a VO2 max test, which is supposed to be a measure of my aerobic capacity?
So not accounting for phosphocreatine stores, I'm going to put those to the side. Really, carbohydrate is the only substrate that is available for ATP production non-aerobically. However, our body doesn't want to do that. The carbohydrate metabolism that our body undergoes outside of mitochondria build up metabolic byproducts that initiate fatigue in the muscle, that inhibit the muscle's optimal ability to create force. So while it's not true that carbohydrate metabolism is only non-aerobic, it is the only glycolytic source. However, you're only going to reach that when you are engaged in exercise that creates a metabolic demand beyond what our mitochondria are able to produce. And so at let's say maximal metabolic steady state, which is the maximal intensity one can maintain exercise without fatiguing, would be considered biologically the intensity at which your body is just able to maintain ATP demand, metabolic demand, through mitochondrial ATP production, mitochondrial respiration, using primarily carbohydrate sources.
And to add to that, so during the breakdown of glucose, glycolysis, you have the initial portion, which we can visualize as being outside of the mitochondria. This first portion is going to take a 6-carbon glucose molecule and break it into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. So the carbons are maintained throughout the entire thing. And then what can happen is this pyruvate can either be I think oxidized to lactate, or it's oxidized, right?
Reduced.
Dadgummit.
Because it gains an electron and gains a hydrogen.
Reduction is gain. Yeah, no, you're right. So pyruvate can either be reduced to lactate, or it can be further oxidized within the mitochondria. When it enters the mitochondria, it enters into the TCA cycle, and slowly but surely carbons are broken off, and these carbons are breathed out as CO2. But in the same process, you're transferring those electrons to other high energy molecules like NADH, FADH2, and then those are actually passing their electrons to the electron transfer system, which ultimately results in changes to our hydrogen gradient, which can then be used to make more ATP. And ultimately that electron is finally accepted onto water or onto oxygen, where oxygen is then reduced to water. And that's the process of actual aerobic metabolism. So during, like what you were saying, while we're exercising, unless we're exercising at super, super low intensities where we're only using fat. And I mean, and what I'm saying, exercising at super low intensities, like
walking,
maybe, walking 50 or 60 watts on the bike, maybe up to 100, you're almost purely burning fat. Anything above that, you start to burn carbohydrates. You start to break down carbohydrates. But until that second threshold, that second lactate threshold, we don't see that pyruvate being reduced to lactate. It's essentially all of it's being taken up into the mitochondria. And I know some researchers would argue, oh, well, everything ends up as lactate and then it's reconverted and then, imported. But the point is that we don't see, say, lactate accumulation until we get above that that maximal metabolic steady state. So from that perspective, that's why glycolytic metabolism is also, it's both anaerobic because there's no oxygen required for the initial step, but it's also aerobic because to break down pyruvate fully, you have to have oxygen on board or else it's not acting as that final electron acceptor within the electron transfer system. So that was a little bit of a detour, but I just want to make it very clear.
2 caveats on that. One, depends on what your insulin level is. So if you have high blood insulin, then this is really going to modify. You'll still be burning carbohydrates even at low intensities.
Right.
And 2, shoot, I forget what number 2 is.
You'll remember what number 2 is about 20 minutes later when we're talking about something else. But the whole point is that so during a maximal exercise test, you're burning both fats and carbohydrate, but we're really trying to measure how much oxygen is being consumed. During these VO2max tests, the limitations are how fast you essentially ramp somebody up and get them to VO2max, or how slowly you do it. Because the slower you do it, the lower your VO2max is going to be, because you're going to be limited by your endogenous substrates, not your body's actual ability to consume oxygen.
So the lower the power output associated with the VO2max will be, but VO2max is still achieved. It depends, right? So if you have a faster ramp or a slower ramp, it shouldn't influence the VO2max you identify, but it will absolutely influence the associated power output with that VO2max. Yes. Yeah. That's an important point. And I was going to say, you may notice Phil says anaerobic, I say non-aerobic. It's just nuance. It says anaerobic. The only reason I don't use anaerobic is anaerobic literally is defined as in the absence of oxygen, which our cells are always rarely ever, unless they're about to become necrotic, in the presence of oxygen. It doesn't mean that the metabolic pathways are utilizing. They may be independent, proceeding somewhat independent of oxygen. And so it's just nuance. When Phil says anaerobic, I say non-aerobic. We're talking about the same exact
and the
thing.
reason why I say anaerobic is just because the nomenclature around endurance sport is still anaerobic or
because
aerobic.
People, exactly. Yep.
It's I would prefer non-aerobic. Yeah.
So just to be clear.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yep. So I think that's one of the limitations. I also think that, depending on, and we'll probably do an entire podcast episode about actually like what's the proper way to actually measure VO2max and get the most variables out of it, because
well, and there are different ways, right? There are, like, the question was, how accurate is a VO2max test? Depends on who's taking it. Depends on who's running your test.
Yeah. And I think so I think that's one of the biggest things is you need to be aware of who your tester is. If it's just somebody who's never run a VO2max test that just got told, hey, we're going to start running VO2max tests, the likelihood of you knowing kind of what or them knowing what a good VO2max test is, what the proper numbers should be, other things like that is fairly low. So the amount of error that can occur is pretty high. For example, just was talking to a guy on Reddit the other day who was like, hey, just did a VO2 max test. My RER started at 1 and went up to 1.45. And I'm like, first of all, that's super high. And then I asked him, I was like, what did you eat beforehand? He was like, well, I didn't eat, like I ate, like a bagel 2 hours before. So in
how is
exactly.
he starting off at 1?
So I was like, well, like, how do you know that this is even a valid test then? Because that indicates to me that something is going on and maybe it was one of those things where he was super stressed out and they didn't do a lot of, low intensity exercise in order to kind of get that stress kind of out of the way. Cause when you're hyperventilating, you're breathing out more oxygen, and that's going to change your ratio of CO2 to O2, which can then give you false positives in terms of your RER being super high. So then your substrate metabolism data is completely garbage. So how accurate are they? Really depends on who's administering the test. The second thing is that we want to have steps that are long enough to be able to detect changes or inflection points, because VO2 max, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about today, is like, VO2 max is important because it sets that high limit on what our aerobic potential is, but it's not the whole story. You still have to have, where's your first threshold, that first shift in physiology from primarily oxidizing fat, or not primarily oxidizing, but oxidizing the most amount of fat that you can. You're still oxidizing a lot of carbohydrate, to more carbohydrate metabolism. And then that second shift, which is going from, essentially maximal aerobic metabolism to relying on non-aerobic sources of metabolism as well. So depending on what they're using, are they using lactate? Are they using ventilatory variables? Are they using NIRS variables? It's important to change the test based on that. So make sure you ask people, hey, how are you actually determining these inflection points? And most of the time, if somebody hasn't done these tests a lot, they're just going to say, oh, well, we just rely on the click and drag sort of thing for the VT1 and VT2, identifiers. And if you're already hyperventilating, I can tell you this, your ventilatory variables are going to be completely fucked. And I purposely save explicit words 4 times like this. Yes, exactly.
For when they're necessary. Well, see, but look where our discussion of VO2 max is going. It's actually going to performance thresholds, right? Because a proper time, if you're just interested in VO2 max testing, it's a little bit more cut and dry. However, you're going to offend both my and Phil's delicate sensibilities by not wanting to know all the other information you could get from this test. So a VO2 max test should last at least 8 minutes. Could be a little shorter if the lab, the people that do it are familiar and they did a proper warm up and everything. But you typically want it to last at least 8 minutes, and no longer than 15-ish, depending. They're just talking about VO2 max. However, in order to identify ventilatory thresholds or blood lactate thresholds or NIRS-derived inflection points, then it becomes a lot more important how you're increasing intensity. And that's exactly what Phil was starting to detail. And they're not all the like ventilatory thresholds and blood lactate thresholds. And I'm not even sure about NIRS-derived inflection points. Phil would know more about this. They are better identified either in a continuous increase or kind of a step increase, where you have chunks where you increase all at once and you sit there for 3 to 5 minutes, increase all at once and sit there for 3 to 5 minutes. Or if it's just this continual increase that you don't really feel, it's a lot more similar to the analogy of the frog boiling on the stove. You feel pretty good until the last minute and you're like, oh, I'm not going to make it very long. But those type of tests are better to identify ventilatory thresholds. And so depends on what you want out of your exercise test. But if it's just the VO2 max, then you want a nice increase. I don't want to say slow or fast, but a proper increase from what should be an appropriate starting intensity to you being unable to maintain exercise around 8 to 12, maybe 15 minutes into the exercise. And so just what do I do if I have somebody that comes in? I really want to try to identify where their kind of LT2, VT2, maximal metabolic steady state is appropriately. And I try to have them hit that intensity at around 7 minutes. There's going to be a little bit of error on my part where that happens. And so taking that into account, I get really close to 10 or 11 minute averages on a continuous incremental ramp protocol for VO2 max.
I think you're going to get more value the more, variables you get out of a test rather than just knowing VO2 max, because like we've talked about in previous podcasts, is VO2 max is only one portion of the picture. So I think that's really good, is like, you have to have a repeatable test that you're doing over time. And then the big key is if your VO2 max is not as high as you want it to go or want it to be, like, because it is a prerequisite for high level exercise or endurance performance, then you have to train it. And so I guess that kind of brings up another question that was, and this is what people always ask, is like, what is the best protocol to improve VO2 max? And it's tough. Like, I think there's been studies that show, and I need to do a little bit more digging into the Ronstadt research, because he is the person who really has dug into this, looking at, shorter intervals, longer intervals, other things. But I think it's safe to say that the kind of traditional VO2 max development intervals are 3 to 5 minutes as hard as you can go, 3 to 5 minutes off. And I'm not saying 3 to 5 minutes of just go as hard as you possibly can and then slowly die. It's maximal sustainable pace for 3 to 5 minutes. So this would be the power output most likely that you get to during your VO2 max test, if your test was adequately long enough. So you'd aim for that, and you try to hold that for 3 to 5 minutes. And it's rough. It's developing your VO2 max is tough. And then you rest for 3 to 5 minutes. You rest, it's equal amount of work and rest. And then you repeat that 3 to 5 times. So it's essentially the rule of 3 to 5. And you start, at 3 minutes, 3 minutes rest, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes rest with 3 intervals. And then you can slowly build that up over time. There's also other intervals, again, that Ronstadt has kind of looked at, and people do 30-30. So 30 seconds on as hard as you can go, 30 seconds off. Or Tabata intervals have been shown to increase VO2 max as well. The key is that you need to try to maintain as much time at VO2 max as possible. So that's why these intervals of like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off is important, because at the end of your first interval, you're probably not at your VO2 max. But then you take 30 seconds off and you don't recover all the way. So then you hit it again really hard, and then you're at VO2 max. And then, you just go down a little bit, and then you're back at VO2 max. So as opposed to sometimes during like the 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, like you're going to be at VO2 max maybe two minutes into that interval. So really you're only accumulating 2 minutes at VO2 max, and then you're going down, for 4 minutes. So that's the big key is you need to try to accumulate time at VO2 max, whether that's speed or heart rate or, whatever it is. But from an effort-based perspective, the best protocol is to get yourself like, essentially whatever interval you're doing, whether it's 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, give your best effort and work as hard as you possibly can for that best effort. Don't go sprinting and then die, because that's not the purpose of the workout. It's, I'm going to get up to, whatever that power output is that I think I can maintain for 3 to 4 minutes. And I'm just going to hold it as long as I possibly can. Because that's going to give you that sledgehammer for adaptation. Have you read much of the Ronstadt papers and things, or?
No, I haven't. But this discussion and the fact that I'm on a project with him both inspire me to look more and more into his research. And actually, just hearing you talk about it reminded me that you texted me another killer workout you did yesterday that I got in the midst of my struggle to maintain my workload. And when Phil and I started talking, started this podcast going back and forth, he shot me a training protocol for me to try, which luckily I was barely able to do. And ever since I did the same thing as he did, he's gotten much better. And the protocol that you just texted me the other day was very similar, right?
It's
to what you were just discussing.
It's a little different.
But you don't even go down for full recovery. You recover at more of a almost close to, it's below that second threshold, but it's above the first threshold.
Yeah.
And so you're working on recovering at a moderate intensity rather than a low intensity.
Yeah, I would say the type of workout that we're talking about. So what I've been doing is I do 3 minutes, and I can't remember the exact percentages, but I do 3 minutes at under second threshold, and then I do 2 minutes at 5% above second threshold, and then repeat that 4 times, with the last one being 3 minutes at 105% or 5% above second threshold. It's not quite that VO2 max, because if I was actually doing VO2 max work, I would put that interval to, I think 315 is really where my last test would indicate that I could get to. And then I would just have it be at,
it'd be higher than that. It'd be higher than that.
It'd be higher than that. Okay. So here's actually a good application of this. So the VO2 max test that I'm doing it's
a step and a bit longer.
Yeah. It's a step where we start at 60 watts and then we increase 20 watts every 3 minutes. So it's a 30 to 45 minute test. However,
understandable.
Yeah, exactly. So from that perspective, I would probably be wanting to do my VO2 max work a little bit harder, because in those sort of situations where I'm just getting on the bike, I'm not 45 minutes into a hard workout before I hit those, top powers. I'm already hitting, 260, 280, 300, 320. So, okay, we'll say maybe 320 for like 3 minutes to start out, but it would be 320 for 3 minutes to start out. And then it would be, 3 minutes really, really low, like kind of ghost pedaling and stuff. But I have seen people say like, oh, well, 50% of your maximal, power or something, or FTP. That's just going to make it way harder. And it's going to, I think, take away quality from that high end work. So it's a balance, right? And you can basically say, if you're working close to proximity of threshold, you're probably going to push your threshold up. If you're working close to proximity of VO2 max, you're probably going to push your VO2 max up. It's just proximity to whatever it is. And if you're right in the middle between, threshold and VO2 max, you're probably going to have a little bit of increases in both of those qualities. So that was a super researchy answer to those things. Like, oh, there's not a perfect protocol, but there really isn't.
You're right.
So
I mean, look, simply. So let's bookend it with a simple explanation: is it takes 10% of the force necessary to break your bone to force your bone to become more dense. Biological adaptation is facilitated by biological stress. Mm-hmm. And it's very specific to the biological stress that's being applied. Mm-hmm. So if you want to increase your VO2 max, you have to find a way to challenge your body to maintain exercise intensities around that intensity, around a VO2 max intensity, right? And so what Phil just described is a lot of different ways in which you can try to increase time at VO2 max.
Yep.
And there are different ways of doing it. I don't know if one is better. I don't know if maybe individual biology is set up better for different protocols. Nobody knows that. Anybody that tries to tell you that they know that, they're lying. They're lying.
Yeah.
But in general, you want to find the protocol that allows you to sit at that high intensity the longest.
Yeah. And the protocol that's probably going to work best for you is what looks the most different from what you're currently doing. So if you've always done 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, then that's probably going to be the least amount of adaptation you'll get to VO2 max. Whereas, maybe you need to, do a 30-30, or maybe you need to explore some of these other, VO2 max training protocols. And, there, from the research, there are certainly papers that say, oh, well, this type of exercise is most optimal for VO2 max increases. However, if we actually look into that research, it's essentially like a VO2 max workout every other day for, 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. And for most people, that style of block periodization is not going to be sustainable in the long run. And actually, if you're interested in hearing more about Ben Ronistat's, kind of like research career and what he recommends, listen to the episode that he was on for That Triathlon Show. I'll try to get him on this podcast eventually, but the one from That Triathlon Show is super eye-opening because I think his name is Michael Erickson is the podcast host, but he was asking some great questions like, oh, should I follow what you guys are doing in your research? And then Ronistat's like, no, it's not sustainable for most people. So in terms of application, you have to reduce the amount of times you're doing your VO2 max work per week. And you have to, most people just wouldn't be able to handle like the block periodization that would happen unless you did like 2 weeks of it and then took a huge break. So I think that gives us, an idea of like where to go, how to kind of train it. There is a paper though that I want to talk to you about, Robbie, that was a really seminal paper in 2000. And the authors are Bassett and Howley, and I'll link to it in the show notes. But they essentially look at the limiters, like what is limiting VO2 max. And we kind of talked about this a little bit, with maybe oxygen transport and other things like that. But they do a really good job, and it's a paper that's freely available, only in an EPUB version now, which is really stupid. Not a PDF, so you'll just have to read it EPUB.
But did you get my PDF?
I did. Yeah. Thank you.
I sent it to you, right?
Yeah. I did. But this was one of those papers that I read during my master's degree, and it really helped to kind of put things into perspective. And you'll have to read the paper in order to get a better synopsis of everything. But essentially, what the authors start talking about is that because VO2 max is maximal rate of oxygen consumption, any step in the process of getting oxygen from the environment to your mitochondria could be limiting to VO2 max. And then they start to talk about, is the lung limiting to VO2 max? Or is it more your heart? Or is it your blood's ability to carry oxygen? Or is it your mitochondria's ability to extract oxygen? So I think this will be a decently lengthy conversation. So I think we could just start kind of with the pulmonary system, and then we can kind of work our way down, and then we can kind of give an overview or what our opinions are with what is truly limiting VO2 max. I think it's pretty well established at this point, but
well, I think it's well established for males.
Yes.
It may still be up in the air. I don't feel as comfortable with the limiting factors for females being the same as males yet.
Cool. Well, we'll dive into that at the end then, because it's always, and this is something that I do want to tell people, is that, a lot of these papers that we talk about are very heavily male biased. Research is getting a lot better at introducing females into studies, and particularly choosing females to study, because we just don't know as much about them. And that's a sad limitation to a lot of these studies. And that's a good point, because we do need to really be aware of how we're extrapolating the data. So this paper was written in 2000, and I think most of the data was, if not all of the data, was from males.
Probably most. There's some good female studies in there, actually.
Okay.
That one, it's so funny. In a paper that I just submitted, one of the reviewers is negative for how long ago this research was conducted, but it came out in 1999. And so I did see there is some, but it's primarily male driven or male research to explain these quote unquote limiters for VO2max,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. So the first one identified is the pulmonary system, right? The pulmonary system is responsible for gas exchange. You breathe in oxygenated air, and then you breathe out air that has less oxygen in it, but higher amounts of CO2. And they were talking, and this is way back in 2000. It's not actually that long ago, but they were talking about how the reason why they don't think VO2max is limited by oxygen intake is because blood arterial saturation stays high in most individuals, especially at VO2max. However, in some elite level individuals, there might be issues with diffusion limitations, because the amount of force, or how quickly the blood is moving through the circulatory system, is so fast that you actually start to see arterial oxygen saturation go down, especially at this high intensity exercise. And there's a term for it. I think it's
exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia.
Thank you. Yes, because I talked about this in a talk I gave to a bunch of professional cycling coaches and mountain running or ultra running coaches and stuff. And I really talk about this because if you're an individual who does have this exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia, you're going to be more affected at altitude, or you have the potential to be more affected at altitude, just because your body cannot protect oxygen saturation within your blood. And again, the reason they think this is because maybe your system is so well built that you're just not able to exchange oxygen fast enough, get it loaded onto your red blood cells, especially at that high intensity exercise.
Yep, that's exactly. And so I really think that when we start pulling more experts, we should get somebody that studies exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia, because the introduction you gave is the same introduction I give in my ex-phys classes. However, I think it may be changing.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like when this was in 2000, access to nutrition, access to better equipment, things like shoes, bikes, knowledge, improvements in training, recovery, things like that. I think we may start. I think there's more individuals that experience exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia now than there previously were.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, this is my thought, is that we now are getting so knowledgeable with training modalities that a lot of individuals are able to adapt things like their cardiovascular system, skeletal muscle, beyond what their lungs are able to keep up with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that maybe this not so much emphasis on pulmonary limitations in the past, may be more emphasized now, because we're able to adapt. We have individuals that are such biological specimens,
mm-hmm.
right? Able to do such things that this may become more and more of a limiter.
I 100% agree that it's kind of a diagnostic sort of thing,
Right.
But one thing that they fail to talk about in this paper is the importance of your pulmonary system for CO2. So if we think about this, if we kind of back calculate, if you have an inability to properly exchange CO2 with the environment, then you're going to have higher preponderance of metabolites within your bloodstream. So your acid-base balance is going to be off. And then from there, you're not going to be able to buffer as readily changes to hydrogen content coming from your muscle. So it all kind of trickles back. And then on top of that, if you're then not able to, get rid of hydrogens at the working muscle, then you're not going to be able to stave off fatigue as longer. And VO2 max is part and parcel to fatigue resistance. Like if you're got higher aerobic metabolism, but you have a terrible buffering capacity, then the first change in the first shift away from purely aerobic metabolism is going to result in a lot more hydrogens being produced, which is then going to induce fatigue faster if you have less ability to buffer. So if you can't breathe off that CO2, if you have poor bicarbonate buffering system, those sort of things, then that actually could limit your VO2 max because your non-aerobic system's not working as well.
And hypercapnia will influence your ability to load oxygen as well. And right?
Yeah.
Right. And so not only the transit time, but if you are unable to maintain appropriate blood pH, and then you're going to have a little bit of hypercapnia, then that would also offset some of your ability to load oxygen on the red blood cell.
Yeah.
And this is in hemoglobin.
Yeah. This is exactly what we talk about with Moxie Monitor for doing a 414 limiter test is we have, or I can't say we, because I wasn't the one that actually made it, but there's really smart, coaches, physiologists that came up with this idea that, by using the NIRS response, so SMO2, THB, and heart rate, you can actually start to get an idea, is there actually a buildup of CO2 or other metabolites within the capillary beds of the muscle while you're exercising harder and harder? And if so, then we can kind of extrapolate that to say, well, maybe we're not breathing as effectively as we once thought. And this is where things like respiratory muscle training has really, it's gotten really popular in some crowds and then in other crowds because the research I don't think shows increases to performance across the board. It's kind of, it's like depends who you talk to. But for individuals who do not have the ability to offload CO2 or coordinate their breathing at high intensity, I think, doing something like muscle respiratory training could certainly help to attack that limiter. So that's kind of the first step, pulmonary limitation, maybe. And I mean, it's, maybe in some individuals, maybe in some not.
I think in most people, that's not going to be the limiter.
Yes, I agree.
I think that the population in which that there is a pulmonary limitation is growing, but it's not going to be that high for most of us.
Yeah, so then the other limiting factors then could either be, cardiac output, which is your heart's ability, to beat fast. So, and we know, okay, so heart rate, right, is one of those things where you can't really change your maximal heart rate. You can train a lot and then maybe that will reduce your maximal heart rate a little bit, or you can get older and that will definitely reduce your maximal heart rate. And this is another question that somebody asked is, how do you maintain VO2 max increases sustainably over time with aging? And you got to do VO2 max work. If you do VO2 max specific work, then you're going to mitigate those declines in age-related loss of maximal heart rate. It's almost as simple as that. You just have to continue to do it. So along that vein, the big thing within cardiac output that would then be limiting your ability to move more oxygen is your stroke volume. And stroke volume is going to be kind of a combination of end diastolic volume, so how much blood you're loading into the heart before it beats, your just blood volume in general. Larger blood volume is going to give your body the ability to pump more blood more forcefully, and then they cite papers that show when you reduce plasma volume, I think by like 15%, you reduce VO2max, not the exact amount, but 5 to 10% on top of that. So that kind of shows, oh, maybe stroke volume could be limiting because heart rate didn't change in those studies.
That's good. I mean, so as we improve our VO2 max, both the ventricular walls of our heart increase, so they're able to create a stronger force to expel more blood, but also the chamber size. Dang it. The chamber size also gets bigger. Damn it. Y'all saw that. It moved on me.
Well, only some people saw it. The people listening are just like, "What the hell just happened?"
Yeah.
So
my mic stand just attacked me. Attacked me.
Robbie and I both speak with our hands, so it's inevitable that the microphone bump is going to happen. So apologies for people who. Yeah. Well, down. That's why I have my mic lifted up so I got so much space for activities.
Yeah, that's what I need too.
Oh man. Yeah. We got to be able to dance in here. Yes. So back on topic. Stroke volume. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, as we start to adapt to exercise, generally we see increases in plasma volume, increases in blood volume. And what I think is probably, most limiting to VO2 max, which is our oxygen carrying capacity. So how much? You
just made my former advisor.
I know. I made all cardiovascular physiologists.
Somewhere his eyes are twinkling.
I know pretty much every cardiovascular physiologist that I've ever talked to, it would say hemoglobin.
But they would say hemoglobin, huh? Over cardiac output?
Okay, so I would say, right, cardiac output's important, but if you don't have the structure, the infrastructure to carry that oxygen, then it's kind of just like you're just pumping nothing.
We'll bring him on. We'll bring Karsten on. I will force him to come on because I wonder if there is an offset of people that may be responders, the left ventricular responders versus hemoglobin responders. And so maybe some people can offset poor increases or poorer increases in hemoglobin mass with a greater cardiac output and vice versa.
So how about this? What if it's a time course thing? What if in the beginning
it's
a hemoglobin issue, and then as you get older, right, your left ventricle size and shape is going to then change and morph. So no, backwards. So in the beginning it's a stroke volume issue, and then at the end, or as you get more mature, it's then a hemoglobin issue. The bottom line is that you need both the ability to pump oxygenated blood and carry that oxygenated blood within your So
that's a good point, Phil. I think you're right. And actually, you're going to get me on a diatribe in which I'm not going to stop talking. But when I was thinking about this discussion, and I was thinking about limiters of VO2 max, because my thoughts on this are they're changing. They're dynamic. And you know what I really kind of considered as the metaphor is a bike chain. A bike chain itself, like, what part of the bike chain is limiting? Is it this part? Is it this part? There's no real part. It's all continuous cycle. And so you make a good point. Whenever we're making these measurements, it's a snapshot in time, right? We're not able, we're poorly capable of interpreting a dynamic system that with many variables that are all changing, most likely in response to one another. And so I think what you just said is very accurate. And so sometimes when we're talking about what's limiting, in my HIIT training study, there was a significant increase in VO2 max. And guess what? Hemoglobin mass stayed the same and cardiac output stayed the same. What changed? An increase in skeletal muscle mitochondria.
Right.
And so it's when, like, what's the fitness level? When, at what level of adaptation are these individuals that we're talking about? Right. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Great point.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I mean, that's a perfect segue into, you know, the last thing they talk about is skeletal muscle mitochondrial adaptations. And what they cite is they say, well, the changes in mitochondrial volume, mitochondrial enzymes do not directly correlate with increases in VO2max. So for example, you could have an increase in sedentary individuals mitochondrial volume that's like, you know, upwards of 20 to 40%, that's a lot, but you only get a 2% change in VO2max. I can't remember the exact numbers that they say, but it's something pretty low. But for an individual, for example, like, so in your HIIT training study, was it a higher level, like elite level athletes, or was it sedentary? Sedentary. So this is what we see a lot with people who come to us with Moxie. We say, okay, do your limiter test, see what's most limiting. People are most limited in the beginning by their muscles' ability to extract oxygen. Yep. So that would mean on you know, the right side of the Fick equation, right, we have AVO2 diff. Your AVO2 diff is probably garbage. And the good thing is that your mitochondria adapt really, really fast within 6 training sessions, within 7 training sessions, to high intensity training. And then from there, you get, you know, potential VO2max changes, other things like that. And that's absent of a response to increases in hemoglobin mass, because hemoglobin mass takes, I think there's a few more steps, right? It takes a lot more time to accumulate more hemoglobin than it does to make your mitochondrial function better. They cite, you know, mitochondrial volume changes and other things like that. And in my study, we didn't detect any changes in mitochondrial protein content or anything like that. We just found changes to mitochondrial function, which means that something else is kind of going on.
Maybe like increase in cristae density.
Right. Maybe it's the organization of the mitochondria itself, because mitochondria are dynamic organelles, and I am a big proponent. It's everything is time course, and I kind of started to talk to you about this idea of the temporal relationship between pretty much everything. Oh my God,
right? You are going to make it so hard for me not to just start talking. I have a theory it's that fine. You are walking all around, and I just want to talk about it. Actually, I really just want to write it up.
Well, here, let's let me just finish this idea, and then we'll jump into it. So, I think, you know, from is it entropy, which is like chaos, like everything decaying into chaos. Yep. So from an entropy perspective, it's a lot easier to say morph a structure, right? So if you have a mitochondria and you already have, you know, the membranes, you have the cristae on the inner membrane, those sort of things, it's a lot easier to reconstruct that, move it around, and keep all the same machinery and all that sort of stuff than it is to build more machinery. That takes a lot of time and energy and nutrition and other things like that. Same thing with hemoglobin mass, right? It takes a lot of both input to get that increase in the output. So my idea is that in the beginning, your mitochondria start to restructure. And then from there, you start to accumulate more proteins. And then, I'm pretty sure this idea partially comes from at least your paper with Karsten on, like, it was a symposium thing where it was like, then you get mitochondrial hypertrophy, then you get mitochondrial biogenesis. And then, you know, from there, it's kind of, you know, just adaptations and filling in. So I think at the end of the day, it depends what populations you look at on what's limiting VO2max. And there needs to be some emphasis on VO2max. And I should have said this at the very beginning of the episode. VO2max is the single best predictor of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular fitness. And that's why it's important to measure, at least from a health perspective. From a performance perspective, it's one of the only, I mean, not one of the only, it's a predictor of performance, and it delineates between tiers of athletes. So across individuals, if you have, you know, low VO2 max to high VO2 max, almost without exception, if somebody has a super high VO2 max, they're going to be a better endurance athlete than somebody with a low VO2 max. So it's important to measure, but it's not the whole picture. So I'm gonna leave the discussion of VO2 max on that, and we'll then record our idea about this theory in the extra episodes that I've kind of been alluding to.
Well, for my goodbye message, I'm going to say that right now, in this moment of time, it could very much change, but I kind of consider skill to muscle as a limiter of VO2 max.
All right. Well, I'm interested to get your take on that, because that is, I think, contrary to a lot of other people, Ben Levine included, who is a very famous researcher. So with that, you can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. All of these podcasts are up on YouTube. They're on Spotify now, Apple, and they'll be on many more platforms coming up. You can catch Robbie on my Instagram. Just message me anything you want to know. Do you want to ask Robbie to my Instagram or to the comments down below, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.